we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and support the recognition of traditional Aboriginal law across the nation. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging on this land. Hello, I am Jenna Chanel Hayes and this is the Loving Podcast. For today's episode, I want to start off with some facts. In Australia, on average, one woman is killed every week by a current or former intimate partner. Every day, 8 women are hospitalised with critical injuries inflicted by an intimate partner. Intimate partner violence is the leading cause of death, disability and illness in Australian women aged 15 to 44. Nearly half of all assaults reported to police involve current or former intimate partners abusing women. The Australian police attend a serious domestic dispute every 2 minutes around the clock. That's 720 times a day. And finally, relationship violence is the main cause of homelessness among women in Australia. Today's guest is the Clinical Governance Manager at the Women and Girls Emergency Centre in Redfern in Sydney. Welcome to my friend Katie Young.
Thanks for having me. It's very exciting.
Thank you for doing everything you do for women here in Sydney and around Australia. Tell us what you do.
Yeah, sure. So at Women's and Girls Emergency Centre, we're a crisis accommodation service, but we also provide outreach. And really what we're supporting in the community is women and families who are either at risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness. On any given night, there's 200 women and children in our crisis accommodation. And annually as well, we support up to 1,500 women and children. The experience of homelessness for women and children, the biggest driver of homelessness is domestic and family violence. I know last year or the year before, it was really in the media about, a woman a week is dying at the hands of DV. And again, that statistic is quite controversial because it's now more, so it's over 1 woman a week is dying at the hands of DV. But then there's all the other parts that we don't see. Car accidents, people taking their own lives, all these underlining kind of variables. So the impact of domestic and family violence is much bigger than the numbers we see. Every 2 minutes, the police are going to a domestic and family violent incident. That's huge. And that's everywhere. That's not just in certain suburbs or neighbourhoods.
Across Australia.
Yeah. The statistics we see is just statistics that we capture at that moment in time. So there's a lot of women and children who aren't getting counted, who are actually living in overcrowded spaces, who are living with their auntie or uncle or mum or grandparents, or living in cars. We see a lot of intergenerational trauma. So it's actually also about how do you change that? How do you have cultural shifts in community? And we're privileged enough to now be in that space. And, thankfully to social media as well, we're reaching more. And as we reach more, it's one thing to reach more, but what are you now doing with that reach? And we're led by an incredible CEO, Helen Sylvia, and we're always just coming back to that. What is the purpose of doing this? Is there meaning behind this? How is it changing people's lives, or how is it changing the system? Because I would love to see, or I'd love my children to see, that I've worked within an organisation that's worked towards changing the system so things are different. Things don't change straight away. And I learnt that from working with the women. It's those small changes that we celebrate. So it's actually pretty rad to be a part of that. Yeah. It's really powerful.
So when I was with you guys, I was working in 5 of the homeless shelters that the women and children were housed in. The reason I wanted to have you on is because seeing those women and children and seeing what you guys were able to provide for them, you beautiful women, and you are women, like you are primarily are all women.
All women except our IT guy.
Yes, yeah. Having you guys nurture these women back to a healthy space mentally and physically was such a powerful thing to be a part of. It's really incredibly touching, and I love women. I think women are the most incredible creation. And we are also the nucleus of humanity. We are the creators. We are the nurturers. We, do so much. And I think nonprofits like the Women and Girls Emergency Centre are really at the centre of moving into a healthy future because you're doing the work on the ground.
When you look at domestic and family violence, we're really talking about such a multitude of different things. It's not your sort of traditional lens that people used to view it for, which is the physical violence. Absolutely, that's part and parcel of it. But it's about the coercion and the power and control that's taken away. So from everyday kind of decision making to being isolated from family and friends. And you also don't have to be experiencing all that facet of domestic and family violence for it to be stripping away your self-esteem or self-identity. Interestingly, we just this year started a really great program because this is one of the things that needs to change. We need to create opportunities for women and children and young people to move towards financial independence, to move towards, having decision and control over their own lives. And when we created this mentoring program, when we interviewed our mentees, so the women staying with us and the women in our service we're supporting, when we talked about what do you want out of this mentoring program, the biggest theme throughout the 30-something women was, I want to increase my self-confidence and self-worth. And so they were one of the biggest barriers to accessing anything, to accessing opportunities to education and employment, accessing service. So, a lot of women come to us because of their experience of domestic and family violence. And it's all on a spectrum. Some because it's extremely dangerous and their lives at that moment in time, it's an acute risk, their lives are at risk. Others have been, experiencing domestic and family violence for such a long time and they've done so well. There's so much strength in surviving domestic and family violence. There is so much resilience. And that's another thing that needs to shift. We need to stop being so deficit focused and start talking about the strengths that women, for example, when you meet someone, it's about how did you do that? That sounded so hard, but, you kept your kids alive. You kept yourself alive. That stuff's incredible. So when the women come to us, it's sort of on that whole spectrum of what they've experienced. Wagec in particular, though, we do support a lot of women who have come to Australia on different visas. And then they've experienced such horrendous domestic and family violence, which is so shattering or shattering for anyone, because a lot of this time as well, we forget there's a grief and loss process that people are going through.
Yeah.
A lot of women I've anecdotally just sat in front of me and gone, I loved him.
Yeah.
So there's this parallel of going through the trauma, but then a grief and loss. It's so intense. So a lot of the women that we support are on absolutely no income because they've gone from a spousal visa and they're applying for some sort of other visa. And while they're in that limbo, Wagec is really well known and we're very, very proud. We accept anyone regardless of what income they're on. So there's no sort of accommodation fee attached because I guess what we view is it's a human rights issue. So therefore no one should be not allowed access. And so equity to access to services is a huge issue as well at the moment in our country. And we're really proud that we're sort of on the forefront of that and advocating in that space for new migrants or refugees. We're also now focusing on the therapeutic work that needs to be done. And I feel super lucky and privileged that Wagec have really seen that that's a need in homelessness services. So in a few months, we're actually starting our own in-house psychological services.
Wow.
Yeah, because it's that sort of holistic support and that's therapeutic.
Yeah.
So we can do case management and we do it very well and our case managers are incredible. And now if we marry that with the therapeutic kind of work, we're really hoping to see some great outcomes in the next couple of years.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, it's huge.
It is, because if you don't address the trauma, if you don't, address the pain, if you don't get to that soul level, then the healing's not going to take place.
No, and that what ends up happening is also your worldview changes, and that's your view of yourself. You then distrust others. You then distrust the world around you. So, exactly. If we're not supporting, an example is we could move someone along the sort of trajectory of homelessness, crisis, medium-term accommodation, long-term accommodation. But I've been doing this for quite some time now. Even before at Wagec, I've been working in homelessness for quite some time. And you see a lot of the time, yes, we might get people, families, women into long-term housing, but that sometimes can break down after a while because, you know, that recovery or that healing has not been nurtured. I think these big social issues, because this is what it is. Domestic and family violence is not an individual issue. It's not somebody's problem. Yes, the perpetrator, I'm not going to even go into that. It's another whole discussion. But yes, the perpetrator cannot act and be the way that they are. But this is a much bigger issue as well. It's a social issue. So when things are a social issue, there's a social responsibility. There's a community responsibility for all of us, you know, to be walking alongside or a part of this so that the whole of society changes over time, you know, like that cultural change that needs to happen so that women and children and young people can recover and thrive in their lives.
But also men. The men have to recover as well. It's very complex. That's a whole nother journey. But to actually break down the beliefs that have been shared from generation to generation to generation, that's also equally as important because, again, they are a part of the unit. And so if you don't do that part of it, you haven't healed the entire, you know?
Yeah. And that's, I mean, when you were speaking, then it kind of reminds me it's that condoning of violence against women is that generational stuff that, and it's from our everyday language as well. So not always just the physical part, but the way that society in general, men speak about women or speak to women. You know, it's about shutting that stuff down and calling that stuff out. And whether that's at a family function and generationally, yes, if that's calling out your grandfather or your father, because I want my children to hear that that's not okay.
Or if you're in a locker room, guys, and it's your teammates or my brother got into a fight with one of his very good friends a couple of years ago because his friend was not treating a girl well. And
yeah, good on him.
Yeah, I know. Go, bro. Go.
Yeah.
But it's that. It's men speaking up as well.
Yeah. And this is the thing. Gender equality is not pitting men against women.
No.
It's about all of us working together.
Yeah.
Like we want men to be our allies on this fight against domestic and family violence, you know? And we do. For years and years, and this is where I've learnt my patience from being in homelessness and being a mother. Well, I'm actually not sure if I've learnt it from being a mother yet. You have to ask my kids. It's a whole different podcast. But at work, you know, my values, that's why I love what I do because the values I espouse, I also get to live them throughout my working life.
Yeah.
So it's a beautiful synergy. But my friends I've known for years and they come from all walks of life, particularly, you know, from childhood or high school. And for years they'll, you know, raise their eyes or be like, oh, you're so politically correct. Stop being so PC.
Yeah.
And it never really bothered me because I'm quite staunch and I'm also not shy. I'm quite confident. So I've always kind of kept on that same trajectory of my language and, you know, how I've called people out at barbecues. But what's cool is now, 3, 4, 5 years on, we actually, and we've matured, we get older, obviously. We now have these really great conversations and we now have them in front of our young children.
Amazing.
Yeah. And we now, like if I hear something my boy says about, you know, some banter that's been going on at school, I'll ask him and his friends, hey, did you say something to so-and-so? Because it's not cool that he says that. And they're all like, it's really cool that, yeah, we told him. And I'm like, okay, here we go. This is the change. This is the stuff, you know?
Do you think that is because of society? Your friends have been open to it because society is progressing at a faster rate?
Yeah. I mean, there's still some big areas in society. Like this stuff has to go everywhere. It has to go from, you know, it has to have a whole of school like education approach, not just little tick box token exercises about, you know, speaking about healthy relationships and calling everyone else. You know, you've got to look at it, you know, we're obviously a non-religious service, but you've got to look at the religious sort of domain as well. We've got sports. You mentioned sports before. There's so many parts of community. And look, I am very lucky, you know, it's like whatever you follow on social media, you're going to see a lot of that. And we forget we've got to actually have conversations with the rest who actually may not always think this way. So I think that work still has a lot of work to do.
Yeah, we're talking about sexism, but it's racism. It's all...
Yeah. Absolutely. That intersectionality between discrimination, bullying, domestic and family violence and healthy relationships, they're the things that we want to start seeing in schools. Mm-hmm. We want kids to understand the intersectionality, you know. Mm-hmm. And this is what, interesting enough, what I was talking about before, you know, we have a woman or a child or a young person sitting in front of us, and their experience in the world is based on their race, their class, their gender, in particular their gender, you know, speaking about women. But then there's that intersectionality on a bigger level, and we need kids to start understanding that as well. Yeah. And they're the things we're not always speaking about. I think being a country that was settled the way that we were, or colonisation, we still live in a very racist. It comes from one dominant sort of culture still. And I think that stuff is changing, but it needs to probably happen a little bit quicker than it is.
It is changing. People are beginning to do the work, but it needs to be done on a mass scale. Yeah. But we're not quite there yet.
No.
But hopefully it's moving in the right direction, and it'll pick up the pace, and it won't be too long until we're all living in paradise.
Yes, hopefully. I mean, there's always going to be issues, but I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree that we are moving in the right direction. And I definitely, 20-odd years ago, whatever, I definitely didn't see, and I was seeking it even as a teenager. Like, I've always thought and felt the way I feel about social justice and social change. And I have to admit, if I would think back to a teenager, I didn't see the types of incredible, staunch women that are around now. And that's because of social media, I guess, of course. Like, But I think that's helped a lot, you know. But then again, it's about how do we guide our young people or our future leaders, so to speak, to be accessing that information that is about social change and inclusivity and diversity.
Just equal rights.
Yeah. I know you say it like that, and it's funny because I was like, it seems so simple, but it's so complicated.
Yeah. I think intersectionality is one of the areas that is so incredibly complex. And I think it's something that is quite difficult for white society to get a grasp on because we've just been flowing through life, easy, just moving. White person in a white world, there's nothing to think about. It just everything is just what it is. Can you talk a bit on intersectionality?
Yeah, sure. I guess at an individual level, it's about, you know, in the sort of work that we do, we have to look at the individual that's in front of us and not all the women that have come through our service. So everyone's experience is different. So that first and foremost is something you should have been, you know, probably taught in Social Work 101, so to speak. But now this lens of intersectionality, I think, is a shift even in our sector, and I still think some people are finding it hard to grasp with. So it's just understanding, you know, we're based in Redfern, and so we feel very privileged and very lucky to be based in Redfern because of the history it has for Indigenous people and the power that it has, but also understanding that journey. And I can't speak to that. Our Indigenous women can definitely speak to that. But it's about understanding that when someone comes through our door, her experience as a woman is one experience. And then you have the next layer of her experience of her race. So whether that's a woman from an Indigenous background or a woman who's a new migrant to Australia, and then also the class that she comes from. And we do. Homelessness affects everybody. But it's understanding sort of, I mean, there are three sort of broad levels to think about. You know, you've also got to think in terms of their identity. How does someone that's sitting in front of you identify as? So when we're working with women, children and young people, it's actually thinking of all those things and not just the fact that they're homeless or they've experienced a DV, because that intersectionality of their experience is also how they've experienced oppression, how they've experienced disadvantage in society.
If you're a Black Muslim woman,
yes,
those layers of oppression. Okay, you're a woman. Okay, there's a level of oppression. Okay, your skin color is not white. Okay, there's an added level of oppression. Okay, you come from a Muslim family, another level of oppression. The more layers of oppression that a person is subject to is...
Well, then the more complex or the more things you need to unpack, you know, and when they're ready. This assumption we hold at Wagec stems to so many facets of what we're talking about. But on the subject of intersectionality, our number one assumption is the woman is the primary source of truth. Her experience is the primary source of truth. You know, we understand our culture, our funding bodies need quantifiable data. We don't dismay that and we respect that. But number one is that person in front of you, their experience is the primary source of truth. So we need to understand from their perspective how all those things that you just mentioned, how they have affected her walk through life, how those forms of oppression have, you know, affected her and brought her to our service. Yeah, so it's about thinking about all these things, you know, as opposed to just you've got this real sort of surface idea about homelessness, but there's all these underlying things that this woman has experienced that has brought her to this position, you know? And I think talking about it, and this is why the therapeutic stuff is going to be really, really helpful, because that talking about it and giving someone a space to feel heard and seen and not just, oh, yeah, I need a house and I need finances will be really, really powerful.
Well, I think people do find it challenging to talk about that stuff because they themselves hold judgments. You know, we all have these beliefs and which we judge other people based on those beliefs. So it's very difficult to talk about stuff to somebody because you're forced to face your own judgments on that. And so then you're forced to self-reflect, you know, and that's what we should be doing. And I think we are doing. But it takes a certain level of growth and I guess confidence in one's own journey to begin to be able to have those discussions.
Yeah, and I'll never, you just reminded me, I was always taught from you know, I started off doing a welfare diploma at TAFE many moons ago to now psychology, but in all that area of education, I was taught you need to start becoming comfortable in the uncomfortable, you know, and it's really, really important. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of it's actually more about the person there supporting than the person in front of you that needs support, why the questions aren't getting asked or why the stuff's not getting unpacked. And I think that's definitely changing. I just hope to see it change more, for us to understand people's journeys more or, you know, being comfortable asking those uncomfortable questions. Because you're right, it's actually uncomfortable for the person asking the questions as opposed, because people just want to be seen and heard.
Yeah.
That's what we want to create for that change to happen.
Yeah.
At the individual level.
Race is a big conversation. And I think that white people have always struggled to say black. They've struggled to say the word black, you know. Those are lived experiences. Being black is a lived experience. So, you know, we classify our society based on race in so many ways, and it's fine to use colour to do that, but it's not okay to have colour be a part of the healing conversation. You can't have the healing without becoming comfortable in saying black, in saying white, in saying racist, you know. We've got to be able to say it, these words, to be able to move forward and move through the healing.
Yeah. And that, you know, that just, it really, I mean, sometimes this stuff is just so clear. But I mean, particularly obviously for someone who's worked in it for a while and seeks this information and learning and understanding. But that conversation is so much harder because the people from a systems level that control this are still white people. So they are so afraid of having these conversations because they're so afraid of what that change means. It's the same when you look at gender equality. They're so afraid of that change because then they lose the power. And it's majority privileged middle-class white men.
Is it subconscious?
I would say it's a bit of both, to be honest. I think for some it's subconscious because it's entrenched in the way you're socialised as a white person, and particularly a white male and middle class. For others, I think they're very aware. Like you look at some of the leaders around the world, some it's subconscious and some it's absolutely conscious, because if you've got that much power and control, much like at an individual level in a domestic violent household, there is a conscious element of knowing what you're doing.
And power.
Yeah.
And responsibility.
Yeah.
And if you don't even know the answer, then because you feel responsible, you go find the answer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we talk a lot about language, which then stems into conversation. So you're right. The language has to change about how we speak about people, things, societal changes.
Yeah.
But the conversations have to keep coming. And I'm so lucky because at Wagec, it's all we talk about.
Yeah.
So it's so embedded. And for some people that come into Wagec, or for some people who work in homelessness at other services, these aren't the conversations they're having either. They're just doing great work.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel really, really, really lucky to be at a service where we're like, okay, how are we going to make a difference? Yes, we're doing that really well in our business as usual, so to speak, but how do we make a social impact? What's our purpose in that regard?
Yeah. And I think it's very easy to look at America and make that judgment, oh, they're a mess, you know, you see it all online, but at least they're talking about it. In Australia, we have so much work to do. They're ahead of us because they're actually having the conversations and we're still brushing it under the carpet.
Yeah.
Oh, no, don't talk about that. No, don't say that. Don't.
Yeah.
If you don't talk about it, it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And
if you don't talk about it, we will still have people in Australia, in a developed country in 2021, who are still not getting their human rights met. And this is it's not funny at all, but this is the ironic thing about how we view, you know, this language is so important. I even just used it. You use developing country, developed country. Mm-hmm. And then therefore, when you talk about Australia and you say it's a developed country, you have all these preconceived assumptions about how we should be living or how people live. Mm-hmm. But there are still people in our country whose basic human rights are not getting met. Mm-hmm. And that's just not okay. Mm-hmm. And it's because of the choices in language we use. It's because of exactly what you said. We hush things. You know, or things come up and whoever's in the political seat at the time, then things go away. You know what I mean? Like it's this whole...
Or the media closes the curtain.
Yeah.
Like when a group of people, they were protesting outside of a morning show about an Indigenous issue, they just closed the curtain.
Yeah, wow.
They just closed the curtain.
There you go. There it is in broad daylight, exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they could maintain the white perspective.
The dialogue, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And that's why, though, it's the interesting thing I was saying before. That's why, like, when you're following certain media or certain things on your social media, like 4 years ago with the US elections, I was like, oh no, I don't think he'll get in. I think it'll be because everything I follow tells me the way that I feel and value and think anyway.
Yeah.
And I've actually that shift's probably only come for me in the last 12 months. I am now, with my fellow colleagues and stuff at Wagec, with these amazing women, now looking at the other side.
Yes.
You know, because we've got to have, and that's an interesting, I have to admit, I sometimes get uncomfortable having that conversation with others because I still feel like a 15-year-old, you know, angry at the world and, you know, the injustice in the world. So, yeah, I think we all have work to do all the time to be able to make the world safer, more equal for everybody.
Healthier.
Yeah, healthier. Yeah, it's a great word. Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to talk to you about was the Me Too movement. Such an important thing to happen. And I work in the industry and, you know, I've been in offices in Hollywood and had like 2-hour-long conversations like this one with men who work in the industry, and at the end, as I'm leaving, they'll try and kiss me and, you know, they'll try and pull me close. And I get that might be an opportunity for a lot of women and a lot of women might take that opportunity. I'm like, oh, my parking ticket. I'm like, I would like look around for my whatever to try and step back to get some space to get out of there. Mm-hmm. But I'm privileged. But what about the women who are homeless? What about, you know, has the Me Too movement had an impact on the way they live their life?
Do you mean in the essence, does the Me Too movement, has it enabled them or empowered them to be able to have a voice?
Yeah, has it filtered?
Probably not.
So the Me Too movement has been amazing, but it's only been really amazing for the privileged society. It hasn't reached the beautiful women in the African villages who hold those villages together. You know, it hasn't reached the women who are living homeless on the streets in Australia. It hasn't. There's just so much more work to do, and it's the Me Too movement is wonderful. We need to create something that encompasses all women around the world.
And when you were speaking then, this is not our forte. There are some incredible services out there doing incredible work with women who are trafficked or forced marriage or slave labour, which happens all around the world. Again, this doesn't just happen in developing countries.
Yeah.
This happens here where we have forced marriages, slave labour, all of that here. Yeah, so no, those women, I mean, even the women we work with who might be having sex for accommodation to feel like they've, got a roof over their head, definitely they don't feel empowered to be able to say, because all they're worrying about is their survival.
100%.
So there's, I think just, again, it's that intersectionality, right? It's about that class. It's about the privileged few. This conversation came up at work around the Me Too movement. I'm speaking from conversations I've had with incredibly awesome Indigenous women in my lives and in our sector. It got brought up to me during this time that even feminism, that movement was a very privileged white experience.
Yeah.
It left out Indigenous women in our country.
Yeah.
It left out Black women in other countries.
Yeah.
So again, the Me Too movement possibly mirrors that experience, back then as well.
Yeah.
What do we do to include everybody? We bring everyone into the conversation. I think any change, everyone has to be brought in to the conversation to begin with and then the decision making around what do we do, I worked in community development for a short while and I worked over in the Solomon Islands, and so many of the awesome women or expats as they're called who were working there, it's kind of this, again, from a privileged perspective, would kind of be like, oh, any of the work we do here won't last. And of course it won't last because we're going in. You see this all around the world, but it's no different in Australia. Everybody has to be brought into the decision making, and particularly from the work that we do from a domestic and family violence perspective, we talk about what we need to give is people opportunities who have experienced domestic and family violence to have power and control over their decision making in their life. And to do that, that's about bringing them in on the conversation,
Letting them lead the conversation.
Yeah, even better.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that was good. It's true.
I look at Africa. I mean, I've been spending a bit of time in Africa the last couple of years. As much as the Western world, the white world wants to go in with their ideas, it's got to come from the community. They drive the change. I was in Uganda last year and such a beautiful place, and just seeing all of this land being cleared primarily for tourism. Tourism is another dependency on the Western world.
Yes.
And that is not healthy. It's about building self-sustainable communities that are completely in power of their own lives and their own future. I just saw it in the Philippines as well. The impact that tourism has is pretty dire from an environmental perspective, but also the effect that we're having on the culture as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah. And then how do you get, this is not my forte or expertise, but it's then, because from an economic perspective, so it's about having that balance, isn't it?
Putting boundaries in place,
and
prioritizing environment, prioritizing culture, prioritizing the people on the ground, and ensuring that they are self-sustainable. And I don't know the answers.
Yeah, no.
But there's a way. Some islands in the Philippines have put limits, and in Indonesia have put limits on the amount of tourists that are able to go there per month, which is great and does obviously help the environment regenerate.
It's also the really uncomfortable and ironic thing about what you just talked about is that, with the world sort of shutting down, so to speak, a lot of these countries where we've gone in and done that and built up tourism, a lot of people aren't going to survive. A lot of families, and, they're making, even in Australia, we're making decisions about whether to pay rent or put food on the table. And I can't even imagine what it would be like in some of the communities you've spent time in Africa. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's absolutely, you're around sustainability. and it's the same when we work in these cultural shifts. Okay, for this moment or for this year when we write up our annual reports or when the government puts out statistics about how many people we've supported in homelessness, it's actually about what does that look like next year? What does that look like in 5 years? It's about being sustainable, or it's about making those major cultural shifts and changes. We want to, ask women about joining us and talking about leadership from a feminist perspective, and what does that look like in your world, and how can you sort of live that life and have more financial independence and more decision-making control in your life,
Yeah. There are, there are programs like that on the ground in certain places in Africa where the women, it's community driven, the women are in charge, the women learn the skill, then the women have a wage to take home and they take care of their family. So that stuff is happening, which is really amazing and really inspiring.
We've had this conversation for quite a few years about financial literacy, right? And we don't learn that throughout high school. And I think there's some changes happening in that space. I'm not too privy to that. That's not where we sit. But we are having the same argument about healthy relationships. And this stuff definitely doesn't fall solely on the education system. I have a brother who's a teacher and a mum who's a retired teacher. So I get that the school is not the answer to everything.
Yeah.
But these changes is definitely in the conversations that starts at school, and then we need a whole of community approach to this stuff, Or even, we had this chat. And I think it might happen, but we were talking about we would love to pilot. This is with a whole network of us in working in this area. We'd love to pilot, like going into a library and just looking, everything from fairy tale books, which dominate that story about men being the protector or these stereotypical.
Which is beautiful. I love what we can both offer each other. I think it's, as a woman, I have a lot of masculine energy. Like I am masculine and I am feminine. And, men are feminine and masculine. So in a partnership, it doesn't mean that every man wants to provide or,
has to.
Sometimes it's the woman who she has that energy and she does provide and the man has the more nurturing energy.
I think you said it though, and I think language is important though. So I myself don't know yet how I feel about how we talk about masculine and feminine energy, because for me, it's about personal identities. So it's less about, you said it before, anybody, regardless of our gender or how we identify, anybody can have all of those qualities because they're human qualities. And I think that's another thing that sort of needs these stereotypical sort of ideas about what a man or a woman should be. Everyone can have those human qualities and how we personally want to identify with them. Because if you think about it, if we've grown up with certain ways of how the world views us due to, the gender we were born with, someone tells you something long enough, you believe it, and then therefore you behave that way. You enact that. Whereas if we just celebrated and nurtured and fostered personal identity creation for that person that's in front of us, then we wouldn't be so stuck in these certain roles that society has told us how we have to play. And then therefore sometimes then men wouldn't have that locker room banter, or men wouldn't think violence against women is okay because she needs to stay in her place because I need to protect. This is why I'm doing it. I'm protecting her. Everyone also has the ability to be a protector. And I think that's the beautiful thing just about being human. So, I definitely do think from a gendered point of view, those stereotypical roles or language that we assign to those genders is quite damaging. Whoops. No. I think and the reason why you say, the reason why people say it though is because they do identify. So this is where it gets confusing. No, because we do identify with being masculine or feminine. And you can, and you named it though, you can be either or in whatever role you play, and that's what's cool. I also think though, it's hard to, at Wagec we talk about, the reason I guess I'm I say that is because in the last year, or actually 2 years, Wagec have really invested in looking at leadership from a feminist perspective. And so we had to have these really awesome conversations about what does it mean to lead. And your stereotypical first idea about leading comes from a very masculine sort of perspective, right? Which is not about nurturing, which is about leading or being powerful, about management, about making decisions in a hierarchical sort of manner. And so we talked about it from a feminist perspective is understanding the journey of women and society as a whole, but also that actually we can lead from a nurturing perspective and you can be really powerful. And, you know,
I mean, it's just a balance, isn't it?
And the funny thing is, like I did say before, like I'm really, really lucky. My values, I get to live them in every domain of my life. But it is funny because then sometimes I'll go home and it's very convenient for me to just swing back into those stereotypical gender roles. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So even it's hard. It's not an easy road because, like you said before, I'm the same. How I grew up, obviously, is how I was socialized, and I do a lot of work around rethinking those things. Particularly for me, it's actually more the gender stereotypes in terms of the provider and all that kind of thing. And so it's quite interesting to have to unpack that and feel sometimes uncomfortable in that. And therefore, we go back to our default. So if I've spent 40-odd years living that sort of way or being socialized that sort of way because of my surroundings and environment, it's easy to go back to that default. Because it's comfortable, it's what's known. It's the challenges that we all have to go through individually and as a society that excites me. But I also really respect that it's hard.
Yeah.
You know, so that's why I think the conversation you were talking about before is really important, because if we start the conversation, we can then pull each other up and go, hey, that's not really helpful, or that's not thinking about that person's whole experience, or that's actually not helping this part of society.
Yeah.
And it's the same when you work on an individual level. You know, when women are experiencing domestic and family violence, like I spoke about earlier, they've done incredible things to keep themselves safe. And if they've got children, they've done ridiculously incredible things to keep their children safe.
Yeah.
But what happens is those things that we've done to keep ourselves safe when we're younger, over the years, they actually become quite dysfunctional or quite unhelpful.
Yeah.
And so then that's when we've got to have the conversation about, okay, I get that that's going back to your default position of how you live or how you view yourself.
Yeah.
But let's face this challenge. Let's put in the work.
Because now you're kind of, that behaviour that was necessary is now enabling.
And, you know, you get used to something for so long. So it's quite, whenever I think about the individual journey, that's why I always sort of had to compartmentalise the two, because the individual journey sort of reflects the societal journey that we're on as well.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of lessons there as well.
Yeah.
When I was doing my studies, I was really interested in children and young people work, and I still am. I think it's beautiful. But I always worked with adult women because I'm a massive believer in recovery. And I think sometimes our systems, so our mental health system, our public health system, sometimes there are individual people or individual teams doing incredible things, but sometimes we sort of just give up on that recovery journey for adults. But I'm such a strong believer that recovery is possible at any time of our lives. And therefore also I'm such a big believer that recovery or change for our society is absolutely possible. And we're, like you said before, we're moving towards that. And I keep saying this, but, you know, it's the small changes that we have to celebrate, you know, because they lead to bigger changes. And if we're not recognising those small things, we can get really bogged down in, oh, shit, this is just not working, or this is too hard. So celebrate the small stuff, celebrate the small wins, you know, in our own personal lives, but then in our kind of community and then in our society. It's really important. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for doing everything you do for women. Everybody can check out the Women and Girls Emergency Centre. It's
www.wagec.org.au, and we're also on Instagram as Women and Girls Emergency Centre.
And are you open to private funding? And
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So if people go onto our website, you will follow the links to who to get in contact around donating, talking about fundraising. We've also got talking about making an impact from a community perspective, our Facebook page, which again is Women's and Girls Emergency Centre. We've got some great Facebook groups people can join. We've got a book club that they, read a book a month and then get together in the inner city and talk about the book that they've just read. And the books that we're choosing are obviously all around the subjects or the topics and matters that we deal with at Wagec.
Oh, beautiful.
So it's really powerful. Yeah, to kind of filter that conversation externally.
Yeah, and start building community.
Yeah, it's huge.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Katie, so much.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Cheers.
To support Katie's work at the Women and Girls Emergency Centre in Redfern, please head to thelovingpodcast.com and click on Katie. Any donations to this organisation equate to returning power and strength to women who need and deserve it. As we begin to wind down on season 1 of the Loving Podcast, we want to thank you all for travelling this amazing journey with us. We have enjoyed sharing every moment with you, and we look forward to catching you next week when we chat to another Redfern angel and one of my favourite people in the world, Uncle Shane Phillips.
There's truth-telling that has to be told, and if it's told with openness, healing can happen.
And with love.
With love.
Without negative connotation.
Yes, you don't have to protect it because it's history. Don't try to, it's not anyone's responsibility to protect it because it's history, it's happened.
Big love to you all.
The Loving Podcast is a One Love Films original podcast. It is recorded at Forbes Street Studios, Woolloomooloo by Charlotte Rochecouste and Nicholas Rowse. Our editors are Zoltan Fecso and Jenna Hayes. Our music is composed by Jenna Pratt and guitarist Joshua Gonzalez. Podcast photography and cover art is created by Sarah Fountain. Our behind-the-scenes photographers/videographers are Daniele Massacci, Barnaby Downes, Paul King and Ryan Andrew Lee. Our podcast imagery is created at Innkeeper Studios. I am your narrator, Victoria Jane Hind, and our producer is Jenna Hayes.